Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Dr. Ricardo Nazario Colón. He is the Senior Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the State University of New York System. He has made significant contributions in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. He was the Chief Diversity Officer at Western Carolina University, and his career also includes roles such as the Director of the Office of Diversity Programs at Western Kentucky University and the Director of Student Activities, Inclusion, and Leadership at Morehead State University. He's also a founding member of the Affrilachian Poets, a grassroots group of African American poets living in the Appalachian region. How are you doing today?
I am doing well, thank you. Glad
Yeah,
to be.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for coming on the podcast, and I'm really excited to get into today's conversation. You're calling in from New York?
I am. It's a beautiful day in the capital district of New York, Albany, New York.
I keep forgetting that sometimes. Sometimes I hear so much about New York City, I forget that the capital is Albany.
Correct, correct. Yeah, we
Yeah.
have a beautiful state, and we have SUNY campuses all across our state. We have 64 campuses throughout the state of New York.
Wow. And how does that work? Is there one kind of primary
So,
area?
so SUNY is the largest state university system in the country. We have four university centers, which are our doctoral research institutions. We also have comprehensive, which are our master's level. We have professional schools, medical schools. We have 30 community colleges.
Wow.
So we have something for everyone in the state of New York and beyond.
So it's been built over a long period of time. When was it first built?
So we go back to nearly a century of State
Mm,
University of New York higher education. And of course, over the years, you add more.
great. And so, I recently just had a conversation, the previous episode, and we spoke a lot about urban education and we started talking about the concept of diversity. And I'm really excited to go more into that today. Because I think one of the hardest things about policies, often we have these buzzwords that can mean so much, but nobody actually ever has pinned down what it actually means. So when we use words like diversity, for example, everyone has a different conception of what that means, what that really looks like. And so I think that would be a great place to kind of build our foundation for the rest of this conversation. But for you, what does the word diversity mean?
Yeah. So, and thank you for that question, because I think it's really important for people to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as separate concepts, right? So as much as we can, rather than say DEI, let's talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for me, diversity refers to the inclusion and representation of different groups of people, which can be based on a number of characteristics, right? Race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, language, culture, even religion. I think it's important for people to understand that it is not one single thing, but it is this combination of these characteristics who makes us human, right? It emphasizes
Mm,
the value of the individual, group differences within a context such as workplace or education. So it is complex, yet is very simple and straightforward when we're talking about diversity.
mm. I guess the reason I think sometimes it can be more complex is because I feel like from a university perspective or any hiring practice or any place where diversity plays a role, one of the questions is which forms of diversity do we value more than other forms of diversity? So on a university campus, for example, I often feel that intellectual capacity is something people aren't really okay with. If you have to know how to read. So they're not having a diverse group of people who perhaps don't know how to read, and so that you can get a better understanding of, different forms of upbringings and intellectual capacity. And everyone has to have a certain level of math. It's not like people can't count. So when we speak about diversity, which is what one of my main questions is, are there certain forms of diversity we prioritize over others when it comes to college campuses, for example?
Yeah, I understand the purpose of that question, but I'm going to say no. And the
Hmm.
reason I'm saying no is because over decades of engaging in this work, and I can make the argument that diversity, equity, and inclusion has been part of the higher ed conversations from the first day that we decided to admit only men to higher education. That was the diversity conversation.
Hmm.
And a decision was made to not let women enter higher ed. Then we had another conversation whether we let people of color, African Americans, formerly enslaved individuals to attend uh, higher education. And a yes or a no answer was brought forward. That was a diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. We didn't have the language we have today, but higher ed has been engaged in this type of conversation since its inception. I say no because we learned that a holistic approach is more, how would I say, um, lead us to appreciate the various contributions of individuals around diversity, and it gives us a more comprehensive benefits. Now, however, there are situations where institutions may feel that they need to focus on access for a particular group that has never participated in programs or higher education, right? So women in the STEM fields is one way of looking at it, right? We know that they are not very well represented in engineering, in some areas of business. So you would see that in that case, you might see an institution focusing some efforts in recruiting individuals to those type of fields. Then you would have areas of the country where you don't have a localized population, whether it's Native indigenous people, whether it's African Americans or Hispanics or international populations, and because we know that the 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 variety in individuals in higher ed can yield a more enriching experience for individuals. You might find that institutions will try to or will work on doing some recruitment to bring in those populations.
Hmm.
So there is an emphasis, but the emphasis is trying to remediate a gap that's trying to enrich the opportunities for all students um, in higher education.
Hmm. Enrich the access to that opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay, so because one question that I have is, and this is something that I'm kind of conflicted with, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, is that when we speak about diversity, oftentimes what I hear is this utilitarian argument for why diversity is important. Because they're like, if we have diversity on a college campus, we'll be able to, have more discussions on these complex issues where we're able to hear everyone's perspective, and we're not like it still comes down to a point of how is it useful for me to be able to have diversity on a campus. And I've heard a lot of arguments in this kind of manner. Would you say that this is the best way to approach diversity, that diversity is something that should be strived for so long as it has some sort of like utilitarian good? Because I think then the challenge that ends up happening is there are situations where there isn't a utilitarian good, but diversity is still important in those cases.
Yeah. No, I think that we live in a very diverse planet, and to walk around without understanding the place that we live in, to have a fulfilled life, a complete life that is absent of our understanding and our relationships to this planet, to the people that live in this planet, kind of lives a gap for us as human beings. And I think part of the goal that we ought to have as human beings is to be curious about the place that we live in, that we exist in,
Mm,
to want more out of just our localized area, to a greater understanding. So there is, as you say, a utilitarian aspect to it, but to be able to navigate communities, to be able to speak intelligently about matters of the world, to be able to not deal in stereotypes, to be able to think and say, Native people, indigenous people to North America actually exist today. They're not in museums. They are living, breathing human beings who walk among us every day, who participate in the economy. They are not relegated to reservations or boundaries of our country. And if you don't intentionally learn about these things, you're going to have a gap and you're going to live in those spaces where stereotypes exist. So I think that in that role, in that curiosity, is where we reside when we're talking about the role of diversity in our lives. And it doesn't have to be in higher education. It's just part of our existence.
That's like very well said. I think a lot about, my own experiences of understanding culture. I'm really glad my parents were able to take me to India when I was growing up, and then not necessarily in like well, here we're going to be staying at the best hotels, we're going to be separated from the people. And as opposed to doing that, living with the people, understanding how there is beauty in difference. It doesn't always have to be like one is better, one is worse, but you're able to just accept and understand that people are different. And you can start to put yourself in their shoes and understand why people do the things that they do, even if they're very different than what you do. And
Yeah.
so that is one of the most beautiful things I think about diversity. And so working on the college campus, what are some things that you do to try to cultivate an environment of diversity?
Yeah. I, I think principally we have to let people know that it's not a zero-sum game, that us embracing diversity is not at the expense of anything else that is additive in nature, right? We are amplifying our experiences. So that's part of the capacity building that we have to create on college campuses, in any environment, even in the work environment. So among the things that we try to do with our 64 diversity officers across the state is we work to create those opportunities and to create ways for people to engage with one another, either through programming, through workshops, bringing in speakers, some very traditional things that we've done in higher education. Higher education is about educating, and that seems kind of redundant, but that's how we solve things. We gather information, we come to conclusions, we make decisions based on that information. We don't legislate. Our role is to educate, and what better place to do it than on a college campus?
Mm. So what would some of those, because I think for many of the listeners, perhaps they're interested in bringing some of these ideas into their workplace, whatever it is. Can you give perhaps a few like specific examples?
So, so to be specifically based on my experience, some of the things that we've done in the past on college campuses that exist, the creation of an alumni group, affinity
Mm,
groups, uh, create ways for people to engage with the institution and to contribute and support the institution through volunteer service, through donations, through mentorships, and even provide opportunities of employment for our students. Other ways that we can do this work. We provide speakers that speak about subjects that are relevant to the moment. Right now, I think academic freedom is a very important subject matter that ought to be discussed in every campus in America. So why not have people debate it? Why not tap into our faculty from different disciplines who have different perspectives on the subject of academic freedom and how does that manifest itself within their discipline? That would make for a great debate and an exchange of ideas, uh, tapping into the resources that you have on college campuses. Uh,
mm,
how how do we politically engage our students? How do we educate them? How do we teach them to research the issues from our candidates? How do we hold those moments on our campus so that students can understand what is truly being said and what the real platforms are and what are some reliable sources of information. These kinds of
Mm.
events happen across not only New York, but across the country. We often don't focus on these kinds of things. We focus on the more sensationalized things. But these are really strong, robust kind of programming that allowed our community to thrive and engage in dialogue.
This point of interdisciplinary debates and conversation, I think, is such an important piece because, I mean, even one thing as you were speaking, I think SUNY is perfectly situated for this is because you kind of work throughout the entire system where you have community colleges, you have state schools, you also have like your postdoctoral, you have because you have the whole chain, the kind of work that you can do starts at the community college level and you can
Right.
build up from there, which I think it's perfectly situated for that, which like other universities don't have that kind of range to be able to.
Yeah, and I would also make the case that it doesn't just start at the community colleges because the community colleges have their own mission. So
Mm,
they're not like the entry point, but they are one of many entry points where conversations can happen. So what does diversity, equity, and inclusion look like at a community college where you are thinking about workforce development and how do you prepare um, a workforce in a rural area of New York State or anywhere America to engage with an employer who's international, right? So,
mm,
so those are conversations that are very different, perhaps, than what you might see at a liberal arts four-year institution, where you're engaging in a different kind of conversation, where you're focusing on a longer term engagement of the students.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've noticed so many differences, even between people, for example, who've never left California, who can't even fathom when they speak about the US, they're not thinking about people who live in Kansas or Nebraska.
Right.
And then there's the people who always lived in New York and can't imagine what the Bay Area is like. It's just even within a relatively homogenous country like the US, there are so many cultural differences just based on location. Let's take aside culture and your background, but just based on where you live, there forms these huge differences. And so in across the SUNY campuses, do you see a lot of people from all over the country attend these schools? And
Oh, absolutely. And not only all over the country, right? But also international students.
mm,
I think that that's one of the beauties about higher education. It is a nexus where people from all parts of the country and the world can come together and have an opportunity to learn and engage on things that perhaps you won't have as much time to do when you get into the mundane routine of everyday life, right? Where you drive to work, you go to you if you have a family, you pick up the children at school, or go to a restaurant once a month, and you have these routines build into your life, and you don't often get to explore as much as you would when you're on the college campuses, and affordably too. So where else can you see world-class performers like someone like Yo-Yo Ma perform on your recital hall on campus, and you can go to that concert for less than $50 or
mm,
sometimes even free? You certainly can't see Yo-Yo Ma on Broadway um, for $50.
mm,
Uh, so yeah, no, I think that experience, and just something as simple as people who come from larger cities and people who come from rural or suburban environments, people who are first generation, and you would think that by this time we wouldn't have um, any more first generations, but the reality is a good number of our population across the country is first generation.
Mm,
Uh, and that makes this work still very vibrant, very exciting, because you're beginning to engage people who are who have never been engaging higher ed and who don't have anyone in their family who can provide them with that information.
mm. So I guess this is where philosophically I'm very fascinated by diversity. I'm curious how this kind of what your personal relationship is with this. So I think what ends up happening is, for example, let's say I look at the world as I purely see it through, you can pick any of the lenses. Let's say I only see it through a gender lens. So I'm like, boys are like this and girls are like this or whatever. I mean, let's say hypothetically. And then as you get to meet more people, then you're like, okay, well, I'm going to add an extra layer to this. I'm going to add race to this. So now I'm going to like, now I've understood the world a little better or a little more complex. Then you add socioeconomic status. And then you add, trauma when someone was growing up, and then you add what country their families are from. I feel like as you add more and more of these layers, what you end up to is that each person is so uniquely diverse. Like each person in them, and I've learned this a lot through this podcast and traveling. Each person has the most wealth and rich history and story, and everyone is so uniquely different. And so when we speak of diversity, how do we kind of also acknowledge the fact that we are all diverse, but at the same time, some of us are more similar. Yeah, that's where I'm interested in.
No, we are no, and that what you just described is my passion. It is that curiosity. It is that trying to understand um, that intersection of humanity, right? We are we are very uniquely, we're a thread in this world, in our existence. We are connected through our humanity, through our biological selves, right? We are connected that way, but our cultural selves are very unique because we cannot occupy the same space, right?
Hmm.
So we deviate from one another even by the smallest of molecule because we cannot occupy the same space. That begins to make us unique. And I think that what we need to do as practitioners and scholars and researchers who are engaged in this world is to think about how do we get people to be fascinated,
Mm,
to smile when they see someone else, right?
mm,
To want to be curious about what your day was like today, even though it's in the same city, because you had a different path than I did.
mm.
I went right when I left my house, you went left, right?
Yeah.
I took the scenic route, you took the crowded route. I mean, those are very unique moments. They're mundane in that they happen every day, but
Mm,
we have to fall in love with our individual selves and ensure that what we have to offer is just as rich and enriching to the experience of someone else. The moment
mm,
that we become dismissive of our uniqueness, of our humanity, of our particular experience, then things become start to unravel, and less people become engaged. I think that's it is so fascinating to think about our role uh, in this world as human beings, how unique we are. When you're in it, you can't see it, but somebody from the outside comes in and they can outline everything that you're doing, and they marvel at it, and you're like, but this is basic. I do this every day. And I think that's, as human beings, we get comfortable in those routines, and we do higher ed every year, and we teach the classes every semester, and we support our students every day and every night. And that becomes our routine. And sometimes we forget how special that routine is.
Mm.
And I think that for us as practitioners, researchers, scholars, we need to make sure that we are in awe every day about this work and
Mm.
our fellow human beings.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that's such a beautiful way, I think, of looking at the goals, the ethos of this diversity kind of focus, which is to cultivate that fascination by others, by difference, by simply just another human. And
Right.
so one question that I have for you, and I think this is a really important kind of
Sure.
understanding how to deal with this is, so I run a few clubs, and something I've noticed that just naturally happens is you have people who feel very comfortable with sharing, and you have other people who, because of whatever reason, don't necessarily feel as comfortable speaking whatever it is that they feel. And so when we talk about the importance of this interdisciplinary conversation and debate, one important thing is not only, and we talked about this on the last episode, not only is it important to have a seat at the table, but to also have your voice heard at the table and to be able to speak. So what are some things that you have seen or personally do yourself to like cultivate not only people having the space and the access, but also the ability to then speak and be heard?
Yeah. You know, so, so sometimes you have to be humble. Um, you have to think about outcomes. What is it that we're trying to do to accomplish? Uh, at the end, does it matter that I get to speak, or does it matter that someone else gets to speak? So
Mm,
being humble enough to give other people an opportunity to speak and share their ideas, uh, being humble enough to say, I don't need to have to be on recorded in the minutes of this conversation. I'm here, I listen, I understand the task. I don't need to be reflected as a contributor. That is a skill. That is an ability that we develop over time, and that we need to pay more attention to, because ultimately we all have a different way of being self-satisfied with our work. So this question, I think, ties into the end to another question about why do we do this work? Are we doing it because we want to help other people? Are we doing it because we want to feel important? Right? I think is if you're engaged in this work, uh, being at the table is important, uh, but it's not as important as helping people achieve the outcomes that we as a collective have set for ourselves. There are one would argue, and I often argue, that there might be some drawbacks for not being at the table and not being listened to, but the work can still be accomplished without being at the table.
mm,
What the important part is, as someone in this field, I need to ensure that my leaders understand that there are benefits to us being more efficient, that there are benefits to me being at the table, uh, in the eyes of my peers, right? In the eyes of the people who have expectations of our office, of our organization. So there are external pressures, internal pressures that push and pull um, against the work and for the work. And in leadership, we need to understand how to best to navigate that. And part of the role that we have is to ensure that when decisions are made around whether we are at the table or whether we are at the table and have a voice, that people in leadership understand the implications to the work. Uh, I don't think there's a leader who wants to be inefficient. I don't think that there's a leader who doesn't want to save on resources. I don't think that there's a leader who opposes collaboration among its entities. So we just got to be better at articulating that it's not only important to be at the table, but to have a voice and learn how to use that voice wisely and intelligently to have its greatest impact.
Mm. I think you said one point earlier that I think is very important to highlight for anybody who wants to, we talk a lot about this on the podcast, but quote unquote, do good. An important question to ask yourself is why do we want to help? Right? I think that's such an important thing to always like place your attention back on any time because I think once you've lost yourself in the I am helping people, then you can start to justify any terrible
Right.
behavior as because you're like, I'm helping people. And so I think that was a really important point, and I'm really glad you brought that up. So one thing maybe I would like to switch over to is now focusing on the equity part of this discussion. And so, and I'm really interested to understand the intersection between the two to eventually talk about whether does diversity lead to equity? Does equity lead to diversity? But let's first maybe start with what is equity? What does equity mean to you?
Yeah. Uh, I love this part of the conversation because you know we are not well. I'll focus on the definition of equity, right? It involves making sure everybody has fair treatment, right? That people have access, they have opportunities, advancement, at the same time, while trying to identify and eliminate barriers that prevent people from achieving uh, those things. We want people to fully participate. Uh, you know, equity also is also about acknowledging that there has been groups that have been underserved in our society, underrepresented, who haven't been treated fairly, uh, who have lived and grown in unfair conditions. Uh, and part of the goal of equity is to remediate that, right? To create opportunities for those individuals or groups in our society.
Yeah. So there's one graphic that everyone's seen about equality versus equity, and I think, I mean, that graphic
Yeah,
has helped me a lot. Would you like, and just to explain to the listeners who may not have seen the graphic, it's like equality looks like having three equal sized steps for people to stand on. However, the people are all of different sizes. While
yeah,
equity is of having different sized steps so that everyone can equally see. And so
yeah,
one focuses on the equality of input and the other one focuses on the equality or the equalness of the output. And so would you agree that that graphic kind of displays the difference between equity and equality well?
yeah. So let me add a little more context to that graphic. So there's three individuals trying to see a game. I think it's a baseball game,
Hmm.
and it's a wooden fence that prevents all of them from being able to see, right? So there's a tall individual who can see over the fence. There's another individual who's probably half the size and is unable to see. And then it's a very smaller person who can't see at all. And there are these boxes that allow individuals to uh, be taller. So if you are dealing with equality, everybody gets a box, but that still doesn't allow some of the individuals to see over the fence. So equity would mean that the taller person who already can see over the fence doesn't need a box. So the second person needs one box, and then the smaller person needs two boxes to be able to see over the fence. That's what equity is about, giving individuals what they need, right? But that it that becomes the challenge for us because someone who doesn't have a box might say, I deserve to have a box. And that's where you get into some confusion when talking about equity and talking about what is fair. And our understanding historically of fairness has been conflated to mean equality. Everybody gets the same, that's fair. But a new definition of fair is everybody gets what they need. That's equity.
Yeah. So in the example of the seeing the baseball game, there is an outcome in which everyone is equally able to participate in. That is the ability to watch the game. when it comes to higher education, for example, what would some of the metrics be that would be synonymous in that example to seeing the game?
Yeah, so um, you want to think about reducing academic achievement gaps, right? That would be an outcome. Uh, Access to resources, right? And resources being those things that can help you be successful, like tutoring, uh, affordable books, um, ensuring that if you a person that has a disability, that you have what is what can help you um, uh, read, for example, uh, audio technology that will help you keep up with the readings. Um, Making sure that if students who tend to be teenagers get in trouble, that they get fair treatment through the policies and procedures of the institution. Graduation rates, right? That individuals who enter the institution graduate at the time that they're expected to graduate. And if we don't know, and if they don't, that we understand why, and that we ensure that we put things into place to ensure that they're able to achieve in a reasonable manner their educational goals. So these are actual outcomes that I think we can look at and work towards achieving.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something that's so important that you said there that I think often is missed out in the conversation. Because I can hear, what some people, how people would respond to that sorry, I'm getting a call. What some people would respond to that. And so, for example, oftentimes when people think about like graduation rates or when they're talking about reducing the achievement gap, that doesn't mean necessarily that every single person is going to be able to achieve the same thing. What it means is when you take the distribution across either gender or race, or you take because there is a natural, I would think there is a natural distribution, I think, that happens among people. When you take any skill, it could be cup stacking, it could take cooking. There is a distribution that just naturally somehow arises of people who do better at it and people do worse. And it occurs for many different things. But when there's a consistent, huge, significant difference between genders or race, then often there is an extra question to be asked there of like, why is this happening? Right. And I think like that is the difference between achievement gap between larger populations and achievement gaps between two specific individuals.
Right. No, I agree. I agree. And I think that when we are engaged in outcomes, and when we're looking at the way that individuals and groups interact with existing structures, um, we have to ask a deeper question. Uh, what are what are the contributions of not only the individuals to the outcomes, but also of the structures to the outcomes? We never question whether the structures have a bias of some sort
Mm,
that prevents individuals or groups of individuals from uh, having those types of distributive outcomes that we just talked about. And I think that part of the challenge in our conversation across higher education is, what do we do with the existing structures to ad- adapt them to the inputs as well, right? So it's not just about the students that come to higher ed, but it's higher ed um, a good model for,
mm,
for individuals who are trying to learn? I would argue uh, that higher ed needs to reinvent itself to be more adaptive to the input, the human beings that it brings. In the history of higher education, the graduation rate for a 4-year degree is 50%, period.
very low.
Right? So we don't question the structure, but there's when you have a structure that yields 50% output, I say there's something about the structure that we need to look at to ensure that it generates more than 50%.
Mm. And that's like it takes a more of a critical lens to actually be able to identify those things. So one question that I have is when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we'll get to inclusion next. It often seems like if you focus on one, everything else kind of also comes along with it. And that's why I'm glad in the beginning you said we need to focus on each one of these individually. So do diversity, do goals that achieve diversity also often have, does it also bring up equity as well? And vice
I think
versa.
they're all interconnected. So I would
Mm,
say, and it's philosophical in nature, right? So
yeah.
I have, there are people who would say justice comes first, right? So it all depends on what your philosophical orientation is towards the betterment of humanity. I subscribe to diversity, inclusion, and equity, but that doesn't make for a good acronym. But I would argue that that's more of a sequential um, process. Some people would say equity must come first. So again,
Mm,
it's a philosophical argument, but they are all interconnected. And not only those, I won't say that one leads to the other, but I'm gonna make argue that they would they they feed on each other. They support one another. If you want to have equity, you always have to deal with diversity because uh, it engages the total of the population. Um, Inclusion is an action. It's an intentional action. When you
mm,
talk about what once you have diversity representation, what's the next step? Action is the next step. You have to do something, right? And
mm,
then once you start doing something, then you start looking at outcomes, and that's where equity starts coming into play. Um, at least in my work, right?
mm,
So that's how I approach the work. I want I want individuals to think about how these things are interconnected, but they are their own separate action items or their own separate uh, uh, concepts that are not only robust in themselves, but they're also uh, necessary for each one of them to exist and and do well.
mm. Something that what you're saying is making me think of, and I actually I'm really glad I'm having this conversation because I feel like DEI is one of those things that has a lot of kind of stigma. It just has its own, world around the term itself. And so to actually like explore each person's philosophy and understanding of it, I think can be really helpful. And so one thing that I wanted to say is sometimes what's really difficult is even when I think about transformative education, I have a hard time imagining a different system until I actually go and sit in one. And then all of a sudden I'm like, this is amazing. I've never even thought of this. And I had a few of these experiences when I was working with schools in India where there were things that they did that I was just like, I could have never thought of this. This is fascinating. And so I think this is also very true with a lot of these DEI principles of like there will be certain environments that are a lot more diverse and equitable and inclusive than others. And when you experience that for the first time, you go, wow, this is a model I want to replicate in the other spaces that I am. So my question for you is, out of all the spaces that you've navigated through, what is one of the most, diverse, equitable, and inclusive environments you've been in? And what are some of the key traits of that environment that made it that way?
But I would say, without naming names, I would say that it is those spaces who truly believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion and embrace the diversity, equity, and inclusion that makes sense to that space. And when I go visit my campuses here in New York, I talk to my campuses about engaging with the diversity, equity, and inclusion that makes sense on their campus, right? So to an extent, I want individuals to look around them and say, what do we have here? earlier we talked about, the differences that we all bring and how unique we are as individuals, right? So we have an inherent diversity already in humanity. And how do we celebrate it? How do we stand in awe of our humanity and embrace it? And are glad for you being in this room, for you and I to be in this conversation today, are glad for our colleagues to be around us, right? We have to celebrate that. We have to celebrate our humanity. So that's the first place. When you begin to believe in your humanity, then you start looking uh, around and celebrating it. Now, an earlier question where you talked about were there particular aspects of diversity that we celebrated versus others. And I said no, because we know that the totality of the human experience is what adds value to our experiences. But however, they are things that we want to have present in our experiences because we are citizens of the world, of this planet. So yeah, we are going to go and do some intentional recruitment of international students or some intentional recruitment of students who are in war-torn countries or who are in in spaces where economics are difficult, right? Or natural disasters have occurred, and those are intentional actions that we take because we think that that experience, those individuals, can add value to the experiences of our existing community. Um, so when to bring it back, when we're talking about who gets it right or how is it done well, we have to embrace and believe that individuals with intellectual disabilities, our individuals, our neurodiverse individuals, our first generation individuals, our veterans, of which I served in the U.S. Marine Corps for 8 years, that all of those experiences are part of what make us as a higher ed institution a diverse institution. And they
Mm,
are, you know, and I think that that's the part that makes it difficult, because we have to believe in ourselves, in our humanity, and there are challenges, right? Because as we were talking about the distribution curve, right? There we begin to see some patterns. So then you begin to say, what can we do about this pattern? Why is this group not represented? How come we don't have more veterans? How come we don't have more women in STEM? How come we don't have no more uh, Puerto Ricans in science? What is it about what we're doing or not doing that may be demonstrating a pattern of absence, of underrepresentation? And those things we can try to address.
mm. Wow. Yeah. And so I guess one of the last questions I'll ask you, and it's something that, I've heard, trying to think how to exactly word this. So when we have distributions of, people in a particular profession, for example, how do we identify whether that's something that happened because let's assume we can somehow identify what human nature is, but that happened because of something, the common example is like bricklaying and like the profession of bricklaying and how there's a huge divide of men to women who work in bricklaying, as opposed to like the example you gave, STEM. How do we identify which ones of those are naturally meant to happen and which one of those are like societal or culturally meant to happen?
Ooh, well, I subscribe that it is all societal cultural, right?
Mm,
I don't know. I don't subscribe that to the idea that anybody is born to be a particular anything, right? Um, Employment are constructs. Jobs are construct. They don't inherently exist. They only exist because we created a structure called society. And then within that structure, we created these roles for human beings to do, right? There was a time in our history when certain, roles didn't exist, right? Like telephone operator, that never existed before the telephone was invented, right? So then we decided who would do those jobs, right? And so I think that it is part of our human uh, way of being and how we have evolved as societies throughout history, that we're still seeing these manifestations of roles for particular individuals in our society.
Mm,
Now, I think for those of us who are engaged in higher education, and I see this being part of the role of higher education, is to create the opportunities for anybody who wants to pursue a particular interest, whether it's career or just an interest, that we provide that opportunity for them to do it, to learn it and engage with it. Uh,
mm.
yeah, I think
Interesting.
higher ed's role is critical in that. Uh, we need to provide those opportunities.
Mm. So I just wanted to touch on that because so understanding your perspective, it's that so an equitable society would be one in which because these things are not kind of influenced by nature itself, would be where every profession in some way modeled kind of the distribution of people that exist in that society. So for example, every kind of profession, including like, the distribution of people in prisons and the distribution of people who are in the military, and all of these things would be more equally split, kind of according to their distribution. Is that what you're saying?
No, 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 no. Now we're getting more into statistics here that I'm comfortable with, but I would argue that there's no natural order of things in terms of who needs to be somewhere. I
Mm,
think that if I want to be I'm going to use a field like nursing that we associate in this country, the United States, with a career that mostly women enter the field, right? If I want to do that, I should have the opportunity to do it, period, right?
mm,
Rather than not have the opportunity. I think that there ought to be a nursing school somewhere in America for me to attend, or there ought to be an opportunity nearby for me to attend. Um, I don't know that everything has to be equal across the board, that there has to be X amount of people based on population. I think that the conversation for me is more about access and opportunity. And can we provide that for anyone who comes to us and says, I want to pursue this field? And we can say, we can help you do that. I
got
think
it.
that would be more fair.
Yeah. I'm understanding it much like clearer now of like the focus is more on the opportunity aspect of it if I wanted to get into this field. So sorry, now that a bunch of questions are opening up, I have another a follow-up, I
Sure.
guess, which is so if what we're looking at is the opportunity piece of it, let's say hypothetically there was a difference in people who go into STEM because of gender. But what if that was because people didn't want to go? How do you identify whether the problem is people don't want to go? Because that can sometimes also be a very real problem. And so if that's the case, would you then tie that to then what do you do then?
Yeah. So if for some, we first need to understand the why, right?
Hmm.
Why are people not interested in this particular field?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a generational thing? Is there any messaging in popular society that's, redirecting people's interest away from this field into a new field, right? So let's stick with a field that has been around for a long time and that we don't anticipate the field going away, like nursing, right? You know, why do we constantly and continuously keep getting an overwhelming amount of women in the field, right? And what can we do to ensure that uh, men become interested in? Is there a messaging problem? Is there a cultural society problem, right? So if we see that there's an opportunity to engage men in the field of nursing, what do we need to do? So we need to normalize that field as a career path, and through intentional publicity, intentional marketing, intentional education, we can address that issue. Right? Right now, we don't have enough nursing schools to address all the interest there is. Creating a greater interest in it is probably not a good business model for many individuals in the business side of education. But it might be someone out there is probably thinking about it, how to tap into a market that has yet to be addressed.
Interesting. Yeah, I think there's a lot of thank you, one, for this conversation. I feel like there was a lot of interesting points that were brought up, and I think the thing that I'm taking away from this conversation is the focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. And it's something that if that's a vision you see for what the better world looks like, it's something that can help influence a lot of the decisions that one takes. And I think it's laying the foundation, whether you're starting a book club, whatever it is, laying the foundation of this is something that we are going to value. And every step of the way, we're going to pay attention to why are there differences between who speaks and who doesn't speak? Why is there a difference between who's even at here? And to constantly question that and to see, is this something that we want to work with? Is this something we want to change? And I think that's a really awesome way, I think, of looking at these more large structural problems.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to engage in this conversation.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.